Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present in this important conference on PCOS. This afternoon, I'm going to speak to you about the Australian longitudinal study of women's health. It's a 26-year-old long ongoing studies and some of its findings on PCOS. Before I begin this talk formally, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking from today, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So, as I mentioned today, I'm going to share some results on PCOS from the Australian Longitudinal Study of Women's Health. This is an ongoing study that has been funded by the Australian Government Department of Health. This study has been funded since 1995, and the main purpose of the study is to provide evidence base for the development and areas of service deliveries affecting women. It also aims to provide an accurate picture of health and well-being of all Australian women. It also aims to provide information on factors that determine social, psychological, physical, and environmental factors which determine good health, and also those who cause ill health through adult life. And the study has been jointly conducted by the University of Queensland and the University of Newcastle. So I would say that this is one of the largest and longest running study of its kind in Australia, and in some sense, even around the world. So I'm just going to highlight the age group that we've done PCOS research on. It's done on these two cohorts of women. One, they were born in 1973 to 78. When we first gave them the survey questionnaire, it was in 1996, and they were 18 to 23. Now they are in their mid-40s, and so we've been following them since 1996. We also have collected detailed data on children, so it'll be very interesting to look at the health and well-being, including PCOS in women in this cohort and how that affects the health and well-being of their children, and that can be done. The second cohort that we've done PCOS research on is the 1989-95 cohort. So they were born in that year. They were 18 to 23 years in 2012 to 2013. Now they're aged between 26 to 32 years. And just to keep in mind that this particular cohort of women were recruited entirely through social media. Whereas this original cohort, the 73, 78, they were recruited through Medicare, which is a health insurance system across Australia. The thing about this study is that it is representative of women living in Australia. And as you can see that on this map, each dot represents at least one participant from our study. So it covers the entire region of Australia. Obviously, you don't have anyone here because they're really deserts. We also have at least one participant living in Lord Howe Island. We have good representation of women living in both major cities, but also in regional areas and very remote areas. Now, what would be of interest to this audience really is, as of last year, the Australian government has funded us to recruit at least 1,000 women in each of these cohort from Southeast Asia countries. So we are hoping to recruit women with Indian backgrounds and also Chinese backgrounds. The thing is, with the data collection, the way we've collected data is entirely via questionnaires. And so it's online questionnaire, but also with the original, the cohort born in 1973, 78, we also gave them hard paper questionnaire. But we didn't stop there. We've also were able to link their survey responses with registry data, such as the hospital admission database, the perinatal collections. It is also linked to a cancer database and so forth. The data from the Australian study has contributed to policy. So you can see this is the National Women's Health Strategy. We've contributed evidence there. That's set up for 2020 to 2030. The National Action Plan for Endometriosis. And I think for this audience, you'll be also interested in that we have the data has contributed to the assess management of polycystic ovary syndromes international guidelines. And you can see all the other different guidelines that we've contributed the data to. So in terms of PCOS, what exactly did we ask? What you'll see is that on this side here, that's the birth cohort of the women, and we do have PCOS information on them from age 18 to 30 years. These were the group of women that we followed them annually, and PCOS is just one of the many questions on health and well-being that we asked the women. So via annual surveys, we asked them, have you been diagnosed or treated for polyovary syndromes? So we have annual data for all years from 2013 to 2019. So 6 years data, but in actual fact, it's 4 years of data because we did not ask the women in 2016 and 2018 about that. So that's the question we used to ascertain whether women have had polycystic ovary syndrome. For the cohort that were born in 1973-78, so remember when their baseline survey was done in 1996, we have collected information on PCOS from when they were age 25 right up to now. We have information right up to age 40. The thing about this particular cohort is that we asked them questions. We sent out surveys, not every year, previous cohort, but every 3 years. So every 3 years, we would ask them, have you been diagnosed or treated with polycystic or syndromes in the past 3 years? So let's see what information we've managed to get out of these questions. So the first one is, let's think about the prevalence. We do know that worldwide, the prevalence estimate varies from, I've seen as low as 4 right to 20% worldwide. It varies by population, but also by the criteria used. But it is thought that up to 20% of women have PCOS. And we do know that the prevalence increases over time. And again, that could be more awareness in the women, but also the change in criteria. So what does our data tell us? So the first thing we were able to do was to get cumulative prevalence. So here you can see that when in 2013, they were 18 to 23 years old, about 9% of them reported being diagnosed with PCOS. Then it's interesting, in the following year, we asked the women, have you been diagnosed with PCOS ever? And you find that that's a cumulative percent. So 10% had been diagnosed with PCOS by the age 19 to 24. And you can see that, every year we are asking the women, the percentages are going up slightly. So what we can say is that in this age cohort, by the age of 29, which is survey 6, 16% of the women reported that they have been diagnosed with PCOS. So that's cumulative percentage. And I would assume that we'll be seeing these women again next year, sending out questionnaire, and one would expect that prevalence perhaps to go up again, even more, the cumulative prevalence. So in the cohort of women born in 1989-95, around 16% by the age 29 have been diagnosed with PCOS. What about the older cohort that were born in 1973-78? Now for this cohort, we first asked them question about PCOS at survey 4. So the baseline, remember, was in 1996. Survey 4 was in 2006. And by then they were already age 28 years. So in this question here, remember we asked them, have you been diagnosed with PCOS? 10% of them said yes, they've been diagnosed with PCOS in the last 3 years. And so we were able to calculate the relative incidence. And what we can say is that by the age of 40 to 45, around 9% of the women have been said that they have been diagnosed with PCOS. So the prevalence is lower than the younger generation, but it could be because there's a change in diagnosis, but also more awareness in the younger cohort than perhaps in this cohort. So that is a thing to note, that it's 9% here. So what else did we find? One of the things we asked the women, and this went in as part of the report to the government this year, we wanted to look at women who've had PCOS and without PCOS and what is their pregnancy intention. And I think of interest would be this figure in the center that is saying trying to conceive. And what you find is that, at the age of 20 to 30 years, around 9.9% of the women with PCOS, that's the green bar, they were trying to conceive, compared with 4.6% of women without PCOS. So you can see that it's almost double the amount percent of women at this age who are trying to conceive with PCOS. What about in the older cohort? Again, here it's amazing. The figure is about double again, So by the age of 37 to 42 years old, 11% of women who have PCOS were again trying to conceive, compared with 5% of women without PCOS. So these are some of the work that has been published by collaborators and colleagues using data from the Australian Long-Term Study of Women's Health. So here you'll see these are the things with women with PCOS, without PCOS, and that's the age, the cohort that we're talking about, 73, 78. What do we find? Not surprising, 72% of them reported that they had infertility was a problem in 72%, compared to only 16% of women without PCOS. And if you look at the use of fertility hormones, 62% of women with PCOS were on fertility hormones, compared to half that for women without PCOS. And this is not surprising, because use of fertility hormones is the first line of treatment for infertility for women with PCOS. That's why you can see that the use of IVF is almost similar to women with or without PCOS. What about pregnancy complication? Again, here we were able to show that women who has PCOS were at a higher risk of gestational hypertension compared with the no PCOS category. But again, some of these numbers are not surprising. They're more likely twice the prevalence of experiencing gestational diabetes compared to women without PCOS. And one of the things with all this large scale data is that it enables us to provide a representative, a prevalence at the population levels, so we can estimate the effect. If you look at pregnancy complications here, not surprising, again, what you find is that women who've had PCOS are more likely to experience antenatal depression, antenatal anxiety, postnatal depression, postnatal anxiety. So you can see it's a lot higher, and sometimes it's almost double that when you compare with women who don't have PCOS. And again, this work has been published. What about outcomes? Again, most of them have had adverse birth outcomes here. You can see that 18% of them gave birth to preterm babies compared to 10% for women without PCOS. Low birth weight was again a bit higher in this group, and also babies requiring admission to special care nursery or neonatal intensive care was a lot higher in this group of women with babies for women with PCOS than for those without PCOS. We've mentioned, we know that they're more likely to experience antenatal, postnatal depression and anxiety, but even outside the pregnancy period, they're at higher risk of experiencing depression, anxiety. And what we were also able to show is that for the youngest age cohort born in 89-95, a fair amount of them even had eating disorders. So here, because of the longitudinal nature of the study, we were able to examine the impact of diagnosis. And what you see is both old a year ago and the new diagnosis, both higher percent of them were more likely to experience psychological distress compared with women who don't have PCOS. The other thing about impact of diagnosis is about behavior change. And what we can see here is that did their behavior change after diagnosis? And that's important. So we see that there was no change in behavior when it comes to vegetable intake. Short term, there wasn't any change in behavior. There wasn't any change in behavior with physical activities. But what we did see a huge dramatic change is that majority of them stopped using hormonal contraception. So this was before 13% before diagnosis, and once the diagnosis, they had the diagnosis, that went down to 4.4%. So that's changed, and it may reflect that they are worried about their fertility post-diagnosis. This is just very quickly to just to show that one of the PhD students, Tessa Kopp, did qualitative interview on women, finding out about the impact of diagnosis. So some women reported harms. So there's this lady, she was 27 years old and she was diagnosed at the age of 19. And the diagnosis was incidental because she went in for an MRI for hip injury. She was active and keen on sport. And then all of a sudden they diagnosed her to have PCOS. And I guess one of the things she was saying is that, would it have been better not to have known about it? Because I can't really do anything about the risk except my general lifestyle factors that I do anyway. So that was an interesting observation. But for a lot of the other women, they also reported on the benefit of the diagnosis. So they were saying that, it gave them explanation, it increased understanding and clarity about the symptoms they were feeling. This enables them to access treatment, and it also validates and legitimizes symptoms and shift responsibility. And so this is what this lady has said, and she was diagnosed at the age of 19. So in summary, really, the study from the Australian Long-Term Study of Women's Health has contributed to evidence on the association between PCOS and fertility, pregnancy outcomes, mental health, and also psychosocial health. What we will be doing in the future is really looking at to study the associations between biomarkers such as AMH, hormone levels, grip strength, lung functions, and so forth in midlife, and in particular in the women born in 1973-78 cohort. So I conclude with acknowledging the funders of the study, which is the federal government Department of Health and the women, and this is my group. So thank you very much for listening.